She slashed his salary in front of 12 executives, called him a relic, living off borrowed loyalty, and dared him to walk. Grant Hollister said nothing. He set his badge on the table and left without a single word, while the woman who humiliated him smiled like she had just won something. 3 days later, that smile disappeared. The client behind a $200 million contract froze every payment and refused to sign one more page unless Grant himself walked back through the door. Marissa Vane laughed it off, first certain it was some wounded man's petty little game. Then the truth arrived, cold and undeniable. The man she had thrown away in front of the entire company was the only person alive who could stop her empire from burning to the ground. Vane Meridian was a supply chain consulting firm headquartered in Manhattan. The kind of company that quietly rebuilt the transportation and warehousing systems of businesses too large to trust their fate to guesswork. For 18 months, the firm had been chasing the most important deal in its history, a 5-year modernization contract with Callaway National Logistics worth $200 million. Win it and Vane Meridian would step into the top tier of American consulting firms. Lose it, and the loans the company had taken out to expand its offices and its data systems would drag it toward a cash crisis it might never climb out of. Everyone in the building understood the stakes, but almost none of them understood who had actually built the relationship that made the deal possible in the first place. Grant Hollister did not have a corner office, even though his title read Director of Strategic Client Development. He kept a small desk near the analytics room where he read through client notes by hand, long after everyone else had gone home. For 12 years, he had helped the firm win over its most difficult clients, yet he rarely accepted credit for any of it. He never boasted, never worked the room at company parties, and never spent time cultivating an image beyond the work itself. The financial reports only captured final revenue numbers, and those numbers said nothing about the midnight phone calls he made to calm a nervous client, the disputes he resolved before they became lawsuits, the fine print he caught before it caused real damage, or the personal trust that certain clients extended only to him and no one else at the firm. Younger colleagues often mistook Grant's quiet manner for a lack of ambition, assuming a man who never chased a promotion had simply run out of drive somewhere along the way. What they failed to notice was the stack of handwritten notebooks in his desk drawer, each one filled with details about clients that no database could ever hold. A warehouse manager's late father, a fleet supervisor's fear of automation taking away his crew's jobs, a chief financial officer who only trusted deals explained to him over breakfast rather than in a boardroom. Grant understood that contracts were signed by companies, but they were decided by people, and people rarely revealed their true concerns to anyone chasing a bonus. The firm's rise under the founder, Old Man Vane, had been built on exactly that kind of patience, though few remaining executives still remembered it. Grant had been one of the founder's earliest hires brought on when Vane Meridian was still a modest firm working out of a converted warehouse in Queens. He had watched the company grow from a handful of employees into a Manhattan tower with hundreds of staff, and he had watched with a mixture of pride and quiet unease as the culture shifted from relationships toward pure metrics somewhere along the way. Grant had once been a single father raising his daughter alone after his wife died suddenly from an illness that gave the family almost no warning. His daughter was grown, now finishing a research program in another state, living her own life far from the events about to unfold. For years, Grant had turned down promotions that would have required constant relocation, choosing instead to keep his household stable while his daughter grew up. That choice made his resume look less impressive than the younger executives climbing past him, even though his real-world experience outmatched theirs by a wide margin. He never resented the trade-off. He simply carried it quietly the same way he carried most things. Marissa Vane had taken over as chief executive after her father, the company's founder, stepped down for health reasons, and she was determined to prove she was not simply living in his shadow. In her first 2 years, she overhauled the analytics systems, replaced several longtime managers, cut departments she considered inefficient, and pushed the company toward rapid growth even as the internal culture grew colder around her. She respected results, but only the results she could see reflected on a data dashboard. Anything that could not be measured in a spreadsheet did not exist in her mind as real value, and that blind spot would soon cost her more than she ever imagined. The seeds of the conflict were planted when Nolan Mercer, the chief financial officer, presented Marissa with a report claiming that Grant earned a high salary while closing fewer deals under his own name than a younger executive named Bryce Ellington. Nolan deliberately left out the fact that Grant routinely handed credit to his team and managed relationships that could never be reduced to call counts or closing ratios. He told Marissa the company was paying for, in his words, a symbol of the past. Marissa began to see Grant as the last piece of unnecessary overhead standing between her and the $200 million contract she needed to secure before the board started asking harder questions about her leadership. Grant had spent 6 months building trust with Warren Callaway, the chairman of Callaway National Logistics, and he understood something none of the flashy presentations from Vane Meridian ever addressed. The deal was never only about numbers. Warren wanted a partner who understood 3 unspoken principles, none of which had yet been written into any formal clause. He wanted no mass layoffs used to make quarterly profits look better. He wanted no sale of transportation data to third parties. And he wanted no transfer of system control to foreign investors looking to strip the company for parts. Warren had only shared these principles with Grant after months of quiet testing the kind of trust that cannot be rushed and cannot be faked. While Grant worked to protect that trust, Nolan secretly altered the financial proposal before the final meeting. He added a clause, allowing an 18% workforce reduction at Callaway, opened a door for a data firm linked to a rival company called Sloan Axis. To access the system buried an inflated implementation fee inside a stack of minor charges and quietly removed Grant's name from the primary negotiating team. His goal was simple and cold: get Callaway to reject Vane Meridian outright, then guide the client toward Sloan Axis in exchange for a secret payoff waiting on the other side. Marissa called Grant into the 48th floor conference room in front of 12 senior leaders and announced that the company was shifting to what she called a performance-based compensation model. Grant's base salary was cut by 35%. His control over the Callaway account was stripped away. He was demoted to an advisory role beneath Bryce, and a bonus he had been promised the previous year quietly disappeared. Marissa told him he could accept the new terms or leave the company entirely, and she said it with the flat certainty of someone who believed every decision she made had already been fully justified by the numbers in front of her. Bryce expected Grant to lose his temper. Nolan hoped for exactly that: a public outburst that would give the company grounds to fire him outright and close the matter cleanly. Instead, Grant asked Marissa a single quiet question: had she read the entire Callaway file herself, or only the summary Nolan had prepared for her? Marissa took the question as an insult to her authority and insisted every decision had been carefully considered. But when Grant glanced at the document displayed on the screen, he immediately recognized that critical terms had been altered, and he understood this was no longer a simple case of poor judgment from the top. Grant told Marissa calmly and without raising his voice that Callaway was not buying a system, they were choosing who would be allowed inside the heart of their business, and the proposal on that screen would send them walking out of the room within 5 minutes of hearing it. Marissa answered that the era of selling deals through personal emotion was over. She ordered Grant to hand over every piece of client data to Bryce before the end of the day. Grant set his badge down on the table and said he would not keep accepting a paycheck from a company that expected him to defend terms he would never put his own name beside. As Grant walked out of the room, Nolan leaned toward Marissa and whispered that she had just made the boldest decision of her career as chief executive. But at the far end of the table, Tessa Langford, the company's general counsel, was studying the contract more closely, and she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Grant's approval signature on the revised document appeared to have been copied directly from an older, unrelated file pasted onto paperwork he had never actually seen. Bryce took over the Callaway account with total confidence, convinced that a modern presentation and an aggressive price point were all it would take to win over a man like Warren Callaway. He replaced Grant's careful relationship-driven approach with an expensive promotional video, glossy charts projecting rising profits, automated workforce commitments, and a cost reduction plan built almost entirely on layoffs. Marissa was pleased. The new presentation looked far more polished than anything Grant had ever put together with his handwritten notes, and she mistook polish for substance. Warren arrived at the Vane Meridian headquarters with 3 members of his board, and the first thing he asked before anyone could offer him coffee was where Grant Hollister was. Marissa explained that the company had just undergone a restructuring, and that Bryce now led the account. The temperature in the room changed instantly. Warren did not argue or storm out. He simply nodded once and asked them to continue, his expression giving nothing away, though everyone at the table could feel something had already gone wrong. Bryce presented the 18% workforce reduction as a competitive advantage, and Warren asked who had approved that number. Bryce answered that Grant had helped build the proposal, pointing to the forged signature buried in the file. Tessa watched Warren grip his pen tighter and understood immediately that he knew without a doubt that Grant would never have approved such a clause. Warren pressed further about data ownership, and Nolan answered in vague circling language, clearly trying to avoid revealing his connection to Sloan Axis, a hesitation that only deepened Warren's suspicion. Exactly as Grant had predicted less than 5 minutes into the core presentation, Warren closed his folder and announced that Callaway National Logistics was suspending negotiations effective immediately. Marissa tried to salvage the moment by offering an additional $12 million discount, but Warren told her plainly that money was never the issue. He stated that Callaway would only return to the table once Grant Hollister personally represented Vane Meridian again and vouched on his own reputation that the company could still be trusted. Then, he and his board walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. News of the collapsed negotiation reached the bank financing Vane Meridian's expansion within hours. A clause buried in the company's credit agreement required it to secure a major strategic contract before the end of the quarter, or risk having its credit line reviewed and potentially frozen. Major shareholders demanded an explanation from Marissa immediately. 2 other clients quietly delayed their contract renewals, unsettled by what the failed negotiation suggested about the company's leadership and internal stability. Nolan convinced Marissa that Grant had secretly pressured Warren behind the scenes, hoping to force the company into restoring his old salary through manipulation rather than merit. Marissa, still unwilling to question her own judgment, began to believe Grant was exploiting the crisis for personal revenge. She called him, but he did not answer right away. At that moment, Grant was sitting quietly in a small diner, reviewing an old copy of the contract and discovering 3 clauses that had been altered after the last version. He had personally approved evidence that the sabotage went far deeper than one bad meeting. Grant received an email from Everett Sloan, the chief executive of Sloan Axis, offering him a salary 3 times higher than his old one, along with full authority over the entire Callaway negotiation. Reading the message, Grant understood that whoever had sabotaged the deal from inside Vane Meridian was now beginning to reveal themselves, and that the real danger to the company was not outside its walls, but seated comfortably inside them. Everett invited Grant to a private business club and told him directly that Vane Meridian had betrayed him and no longer deserved his loyalty. He laid out an offer designed to be impossible to refuse: $3 million a year in salary, a $2 million signing bonus, full authority to build his own team, the title of Vice President of Strategy, and a share of the profits from the Callaway contract itself. The only condition was that Grant would need to transfer everything he understood about Warren Callaway directly to Sloan Axis. Grant did not refuse immediately. Instead, he asked pointed questions designed to reveal exactly how much internal Vane Meridian information Everett already possessed. Everett let slip a reference to the 18% workforce reduction, a number that had never been shared outside the company, and Grant understood in that instant that Nolan had already been feeding confidential material to a direct competitor. He quietly recorded the time, the location, and every detail of the conversation, careful not to cross any legal line himself while gathering what he needed. Grant was no longer loyal to the people who had humiliated him, but he still felt responsible for the innocent employees at Vane Meridian, the thousands of workers at Callaway whose jobs depended on the deal, the promise he had personally made to Warren, and the professional reputation he had spent more than 2 decades building one client at a time. He told Everett that trust was not a product that could be transferred along with a signature on a new contract. Everett warned him that Sloan Axis would win the Callaway deal regardless, with or without him, and that Vane Meridian would collapse either way. Grant thanked him for his time and walked out without looking back. Marissa showed up at Grant's modest apartment unannounced, and rather than apologize, she accused him of manipulating Warren to apply pressure on the company. Grant let her in, but kept his distance, his expression unreadable. He placed two versions of the contract side by side on his table and asked her to compare them herself. As Marissa studied the pages, she noticed that Grant's version protected every job at Callaway, while Nolan's version allowed for mass layoffs, that Grant's forged signature appeared on the altered document, and that the timestamp on that signature did not match a single moment of his actual travel schedule that week. For the first time, Marissa began to suspect she had been manipulated by someone she trusted completely. Still, she asked Grant why he hadn't warned her more clearly during the original meeting. Grant answered that he had warned her in plain language, and that she simply hadn't wanted to hear anything that contradicted a decision she had already made in her mind. He told her he would not be returning to the company just to rescue her reputation, and the words landed with a weight that silenced her for a long moment. Before Marissa left his apartment that night, Grant revealed one final detail that changed everything. Sloan Axis already knew the exact confidential terms hidden inside the altered proposal terms that had never been discussed outside a small circle inside Vane Meridian's own leadership. Marissa finally understood with a cold clarity that turned her stomach that there was a traitor sitting somewhere inside her own executive team. The bank gave Vane Meridian 72 hours to prove the Callaway contract could still be salvaged, or the company's credit line would face immediate review. The board prepared a vote to suspend Marissa's authority as chief executive entirely. Nolan proposed selling a portion of the company to Sloan Axis as a rescue plan, a move that was in reality the final step of a quiet takeover he had been engineering for months. Tessa warned Marissa that the forged signature alone could trigger both a criminal investigation and a civil lawsuit if it ever became public. Marissa was forced to call Grant for a private meeting, and this time she did not sit at the head of the table. She handed him full access to every company file and openly admitted that the decision to cut his pay had been hers alone to own. Grant told her plainly that he could not save the contract if the same broken system remained in place around him, and he laid out 5 conditions before agreeing to help. He wanted full restoration of pay and benefits for every employee affected by the false reports Nolan suspended immediately during the investigation. A public statement confirming that Grant had never approved the altered contract full independent investigative authority granted to Tessa, and a precedent of Ida, guarantee that no employee would be laid off simply to cover up leadership's own mistakes. When Marissa asked what title or bonus he wanted for himself, Grant told her he would not be returning as an employee at all. If he agreed to help, he would serve as an independent advisor for exactly 72 hours with complete authority over negotiation strategy and the freedom to walk away at any moment if Marissa let her pride interfere again. Reluctantly, and with no real alternative left, Marissa agreed to every term. Grant's return to the office split the building into 2 reactions. Longtime employees felt a wave of relief, believing he was the only person who could still save the company from disaster. Executives loyal to Nolan mocked the move privately, insisting Grant was simply exploiting the crisis to grab power he had never been given honestly. Grant ignored all of it. He cleared the conference room of everyone except Delaney Rhodes, Tessa, and Marissa, and pointed out something the entire leadership team had missed entirely. Callaway had never truly wanted to end the negotiation. Warren was testing whether Vane Meridian had the courage to actually fix what it had broken. Grant built a 3-step strategy on the spot. First, prove the original proposal had been deliberately tampered with. Second, present a plan that protected the workforce while still delivering real savings. Third, force Sloan Axis to expose its own use of stolen internal data. Marissa wanted to call Warren immediately, but Grant stopped her, telling her that an apology carried no weight until the company understood with total precision exactly what it had done wrong in the first place. That same night, Tessa discovered that Nolan had deleted hundreds of internal emails apparently trying to erase every trace of his connection to Sloan Axis. But a backup copy had automatically synced to the company's legal archive server hours earlier, and that single overlooked detail would soon unravel everything Nolan had spent months trying to hide. The recovered emails revealed the full scope of Nolan's betrayal. He had sent internal company documents to an address linked directly to Sloan Axis, received a promised position as chief financial officer once the takeover was complete, altered the contract after Grant had already approved the original version, forged Grant's electronic signature, and quietly steered both the pay cut and Grant's removal from the account from the very beginning. Every piece fit together into a single coordinated act of sabotage. Sensing that exposure was closing in, Nolan called an emergency meeting with the board and accused Grant of conspiring with Warren behind the company's back, withholding critical information, exploiting the crisis to seize control, and secretly meeting with Everett Sloan. He produced a photograph of Grant entering the private club where he had met Everett, and for a moment, several board members looked genuinely uncertain about where their trust should lie. Grant did not deny the meeting had happened. He explained that Everett had approached him first and that he had deliberately avoided revealing the full details right away in order to determine how much confidential information had actually leaked before confronting Nolan directly. Then Grant turned the questions back on him. Why did Sloan Axis know the exact 18% reduction figure? Why did the forged signature carry a timestamp from a moment when Grant was documented as being on a flight? Why had Nolan deleted his emails within minutes of Calloway walking out of the building? And why did his sudden proposal to sell part of the company benefit only Sloan Axis and no one else? Nolan reminded Marissa that he had helped secure her position as chief executive against skeptical shareholders years earlier, trying to strike at her deepest fear, the idea that she might be remembered as a weak leader coasting on her father's legacy rather than one who had earned her seat. Grant never asked Marissa to simply trust him. He only asked her to look honestly at the evidence in front of her. In the end, she suspended Nolan and turned his company laptop over to the legal team, the first time she had ever publicly admitted that her own judgment had been wrong from the start. Tessa uncovered something even worse buried in the files. Sloan Axis had already drafted a press release announcing the acquisition of Vane Meridian at a discounted price, and the document had been prepared before the Calloway deal had even officially collapsed. That timeline proved the failure was never an accident. Nolan and Everett had planned to devalue the company on purpose long before anyone at Vane Meridian understood they were even under attack. Despite the mounting evidence, the bank's deadline kept ticking down with less than 24 hours remaining. Warren refused to answer any of Marissa's calls. Grant sent him a single text message containing only one sentence: he had found the person who broke their promise. Warren replied with the address of an old freight terminal in Philadelphia and a meeting time of 6 o'clock the following morning, giving them one last narrow chance to make things right. Grant told Marissa she could come with him, but she would not be permitted to speak unless Warren asked her a direct question. For the first time in her career, the chief executive of Vane Meridian would be walking into the most important negotiation of her life with absolutely no control over the room, and she would have to accept that discomfort if she wanted any chance of saving what remained of her company. Grant and Marissa arrived at an old Calloway freight terminal outside Philadelphia, the very place where Warren had started his career more than 4 decades earlier. He had chosen this location deliberately, instead of some polished boardroom, to remind them both that the contract was about real people, not abstract figures on a spreadsheet. Warren walked them through the maintenance yard, the old dispatch office, a warehouse waiting for modernization, and a wall listing the names of employees who had worked there for 30 years or more, a quiet reminder of exactly what was at stake. Warren asked Marissa directly why he should ever trust a chief executive willing to humiliate the one man who had kept the company's word for her. She started to explain that Nolan had deceived her, but Grant said nothing and simply looked at her, and Marissa realized in that instant that shifting all the blame onto Nolan would only prove she still hadn't grown from the experience at all. So instead, she admitted the truth. Plainly, she had judged Grant using incomplete data. She had valued the appearance of power over actually listening. She had personally approved the pay cut. She had never read the full file herself. And she had turned his loyalty into a weakness she chose to punish, rather than a strength worth protecting. Grant then laid out a new plan without slides or colorful charts, just a folder and a steady voice. The first phase focused on stabilizing the system by upgrading the dispatch software without a single layoff, using a retraining program to shift displaced workers into new roles. The second phase focused on smart cost reduction by eliminating duplicate transport routes, renegotiating fuel contracts, and making better use of idle warehouse space. The third phase protected Calloway's data entirely, giving the company full ownership, while Vane Meridian received only limited, clearly defined access. The plan still delivered savings close to what Nolan's version had promised, but without violating a single one of Warren's core principles. Warren admitted the plan was strong, but he questioned whether Vane Meridian was stable enough to actually deliver on it, and he proposed a condition Grant would need to personally lead the project for 2 full years. Grant refused. He explained that a contract built entirely around one individual would only repeat the same mistake that had nearly destroyed the company already, that Callaway needed a system it could trust, not a single man serving as a human crutch. Instead, he proposed training an independent team and giving Callaway direct oversight authority of its own, a structure built to outlast any one person in the room. Warren studied Grant for a long moment before responding the kind of silence that had unsettled far more powerful executives than the two standing in front of him that morning. He had spent 4 decades watching consultants promise the world and deliver only themselves, men who built entire pitches around their own indispensability because it guaranteed them leverage long after the ink dried. Grant's refusal to do the same thing struck Warren as far more valuable than any projected savings figure on the page, because it told him something about character that no spreadsheet could ever measure. He asked Grant directly why he wouldn't simply take the power being offered to him, and Grant answered that power built on being irreplaceable was never really stability at all. It was just a slower kind of collapse, waiting to happen. Grant's refusal to seize personal power convinced Warren more than anything else, said that morning that he was not acting out of greed or revenge. Warren agreed to reopen negotiations but made clear he would only sign once Vane Meridian had fully addressed the internal fraud that had caused the collapse in the first place, a condition Grant accepted without hesitation. As they prepared to leave the terminal, Warren received word that Sloan Axis had just submitted a competing bid $30 million lower than Vane Meridian's, openly claiming to already possess the entire implementation model the Prosix company had built. Grant understood immediately that Everett was using stolen material to force Callaway's hand before anyone could stop him, and that the final confrontation was no longer a matter of if, but when. Grant revealed that every strategic draft he prepared contained small, deliberate variations in how the data was arranged, a method he had used for years to trace exactly where leaks originated from. The version Nolan had passed along to Everett contained one particular false assumption: a fictional distribution center in Ohio listed with a deliberately inflated capacity. If Sloan Axis used that fabricated number in their official proposal, they would unknowingly prove in front of everyone that they had stolen internal Vane Meridian material. Warren invited both Vane Meridian and Sloan Axis to present on the very same day before the full Callaway board. Everett walked in supremely confident, certain that Vane Meridian was already circling the drain financially. He openly attacked Marissa's leadership, claiming her company no longer had the stability to run a project of this size, and then presented a lower-priced plan that used, without realizing it, the exact fabricated Ohio distribution figures Grant had planted weeks earlier. Grant asked Warren for permission to pose a single question to Everett directly. He asked how Sloan Axis had verified the capacity of that Ohio distribution center. Everett answered confidently that it came from his own proprietary research team. Grant then revealed that the center had never existed at all, that the address listed in the document belonged to an empty lot owned by an entirely unrelated company. Tessa followed with a full timeline of the document's edit history, the emails Nolan had sent externally, the exact moment Sloan Axis had received the file, and the undeniable match between the planted error and the one appearing in Everett's own presentation. Everett tried to claim Nolan had acted entirely alone, but Tessa produced a signed offer letter bearing Everett's own electronic signature, along with a payment quietly disguised as a consulting fee. Warren immediately removed Sloan Axis from consideration altogether, and instructed his legal team to forward every piece of evidence to the proper authorities, preparing a civil case for the theft of trade secrets that would follow Everett for years to come. For a moment, the boardroom fell completely silent, the kind of silence that follows when a man watches his own certainty collapse in real time in front of people whose respect he had spent years cultivating. Everett tried once more to argue that the fabricated Ohio figures were an honest research error. But the timeline Tessa laid out left no room for that explanation to survive. Since the exact number appeared in Nolan's leaked file days before Sloan Axis claimed to have generated it independently, board members who had walked in that morning fully prepared to switch vendors now sat staring at the man who had nearly convinced them to hand over control of their company's entire data infrastructure. Warren did not raise his voice or indulge in any dramatic display of anger. He simply thanked both parties for their time, and made it clear that trust, once broken, this deliberately was not something his company would ever risk again. Nolan attempted to leave the city quietly, but investigators detained him for questioning after Tessa submitted her full evidence of forgery and corporate data theft. His downfall came not through any dramatic confrontation but through documents, timestamps, and the very emails he had once believed were permanently gone. A quiet and complete collapse built entirely on the paper trail he left behind. Warren signed a conditional commitment letter, keeping Vane Meridian as the preferred partner going forward, though the final contract still depended on the board formally approving the new oversight structure Grant had designed. Grant had saved the deal, but he still had not agreed to return to the company on a permanent basis, and Marissa understood she could not simply assume his loyalty had been automatically restored. Marissa watched Grant leave the building alone that evening and realized with a clarity that had taken far too long to arrive that he had just saved hundreds of jobs and the entire future of her company without asking for a single reward. In return, Marissa called a full company meeting and stood in the exact same spot where she had once cut Grant's pay in front of everyone. Instead of reading the polished statement her communications team had prepared for her, she set the papers aside and spoke in her own words. She publicly confirmed that Grant had never approved the falsified contract, that his signature had been used without his knowledge, that the pay cut had been wrong, that her ambition to prove herself had overridden her own judgment, and that Grant had continued protecting the company even after the company had betrayed him first. She apologized to him directly, in front of the very people who had watched him walk out humiliated weeks earlier. Grant did not accept the apology right away. He told her plainly that an apology only carried real meaning when it changed how power actually behaved afterward. Marissa then announced a series of genuine reforms rather than empty promises. She eliminated the compensation system that rewarded only individually credited revenue, established an independent contract ethics board, guaranteed employees the right to challenge decisions without fear of retaliation, required cross-verification for every major document change going forward, restored Grant's full salary and bonus, opened a review of every other employee who had lost benefits due to dishonest reporting, and gave up her own annual bonus to help cover the cost of repairing the damage. Marissa then offered Grant a new position, entirely Director of Strategic and Ethical Business Development, reporting directly to the board rather than to her personally. The role gave him the authority to halt any contract that violated core principles, train the next generation of leadership, oversee strategic client relationships across the company, protect employees who raise difficult questions, and just as importantly, live a life that didn't require sacrificing everything outside of work. Grant asked for time to think it over rather than answering immediately. In a quieter conversation afterward, Marissa admitted she had once believed real leadership meant never showing hesitation or doubt. Grant told her that true leadership was never about always being right but about correcting mistakes before someone else was forced to pay for them. She asked if he could ever trust her fully again. Grant answered that trust didn't return through a single promise, but through hundreds of small decisions made correctly one after another over time. Tessa announced that the Callaway board had officially approved the full $200 million contract. Yet on the final signature page reserved for Vane Meridian, one line remained empty, the line meant for the person formally responsible for the project's ethical oversight, a decision still waiting to be made. The signing ceremony did not take place in some luxury hotel ballroom but at the Callaway freight terminal itself, where Warren invited dispatchers, longtime drivers, and the implementation team to witness the moment in person. Marissa signed as chief executive of Vane Meridian. Warren signed as chairman of Callaway National Logistics. And the final line reserved for Grant remained open, waiting for him to decide whether he would step forward one more time. Grant agreed to return to Vane Meridian, but strictly under the terms both sides had already negotiated. He would not fall under Marissa's direct control. Every ethical concern he raised would be documented in writing without exception. The project team would be trained, so the entire operation never again depended on a single person part, and of the project bonus would be shared across the whole team, rather than concentrated at the top, and no Callaway employee would ever be laid off, simply to hit a short-term profit target. Warren agreed without hesitation, and Grant signed his name, officially restoring the $200 million contract in full. Nolan faced formal charges tied to document fraud, corporate data theft, forging an electronic signature, conspiring to devalue the company, and accepting compensation in exchange for leaking trade secrets to a direct competitor. Everett lost the contract, entirely faced a substantial lawsuit, and was suspended by his own board at Sloan Axis. The shareholders of Vane Meridian firmly rejected the quiet takeover plan that had nearly succeeded behind their backs. Marissa did not transform into an entirely different person overnight. She remained decisive and continued demanding high performance from her team, but she began doing something she rarely had: before reading full files, before making decisions, allowing her staff to push back without fear, asking who would actually be affected by every cost-saving figure presented to her, refusing to treat other people's silence as proof that she was right, and viewing loyalty as an asset worth protecting rather than a weakness worth exploiting. She also made a point of publicly crediting Grant and his team for the success of the Callaway deal, rather than absorbing the recognition for herself. Grant received his full back pay, along with a substantial bonus tied to the completed contract, but the greater victory was having his integrity publicly restored in front of the same people who had once watched him be humiliated. He used part of his bonus to launch a training program for experienced employees who had been overlooked simply because their resumes lacked the flashy credentials leadership tended to favor. Delaney became the very first person Grant personally selected to join the company's next generation of leadership, a decision that surprised no one who had actually worked alongside her. A few months later, the first phase of Callaway's new system went live without a single layoff anywhere in the process. Operating costs dropped faster than anyone had projected, thanks to the practical, grounded solutions Grant and his team had built from the ground up rather than from a spreadsheet. During a review meeting, Marissa noticed Grant sitting quietly at the far end of the table, exactly where he always used to sit, and she invited him to take the seat beside her instead. Grant declined the seat at the head of the table, telling her that the best seat in any room was the one where he could see everyone who would actually be affected by the decisions being made there. Marissa did not feel challenged by his answer. For the first time, she truly understood why he was the only person who had ever been able to close deals that no one else in the company could touch. Years of leading Vane Meridian had taught Marissa to measure success in signatures and closing figures in the clean satisfaction of a deal finalized and a quarter reported. It took losing almost everything to teach her that the number on a contract was never the actual foundation holding a company together. The foundation had always been men and women like Grant, the ones who showed up long after the applause ended, who kept promises nobody was watching them keep, and who valued their own word over any title offered in exchange for abandoning it. She never forgot that lesson again, and neither did the company she rebuilt around it. Vane Meridian never lost that $200 million contract because it lacked technology, capital, or talent. It nearly lost everything because the person holding the power mistook quiet humility for weakness and mistook genuine loyalty for dependence that could be discarded without consequence. Grant never won by making Marissa fail. He won simply by refusing to become the kind of person who had once hurt him. And in the end, Marissa finally understood that a salary could be cut with a single signature on a piece of paper, but a person's true worth is only ever revealed the moment no one else remains capable of replacing them.